There's something profoundly different about Red Dead Redemption 2 that separates it from every other game that's tried to tell a story about the American frontier. It's not just that it's a prequel to one of the most beloved westerns in gaming, and it's not just that Rockstar threw an absurd amount of money and talent at the project. What makes Red Dead 2 a genuine masterpiece is how it uses the interactive nature of video games to tell a story about inevitability, about men and women who can see the world changing around them but can't change with it, and about the desperate human need to believe that redemption is possible, even when you know deep in your bones that you're damned. This is a game that understands something fundamental about storytelling that most games miss entirely. It knows that the best stories aren't about what happens, they're about why it happens and what it means. The genius of Red Dead Redemption 2 starts with a bold decision that could have backfired spectacularly. Instead of letting players continue as John Marston, the protagonist everyone fell in love with in the first game, Rockstar created Arthur Morgan, a character nobody knew, nobody asked for, and who by all rights should have been overshadowed by the knowledge that this is John's story. We already know how it ends. But Arthur isn't just a placeholder protagonist or a vehicle to get us to the events of the first game. He's the emotional core of everything this game wants to say about loyalty, about change, about what it means to be a good man in a world that doesn't reward goodness. Arthur Morgan is a man who has spent his entire adult life believing in Dutch van der Linde's philosophy, believing that there's honor among thieves, believing that the gang is a family worth dying for. He's killed for this belief. He's robbed for it. He's beaten people who couldn't pay their debts for it. And the tragedy of Arthur's story is that by the time he realizes the lies he's been living, he's already dying. The tuberculosis diagnosis isn't just a plot device to give Arthur's redemption arc a ticking clock. It's a metaphor for the entire world of the game. Just as Arthur's body is being destroyed from within by a disease he can't fight, the Old West is being killed by civilization, by progress, by the inevitable march of history that turns outlaws into anachronisms. What's remarkable about Arthur as a character is how the game lets you shape who he becomes without ever letting you forget who he was. The honor system in this game isn't just a binary good or evil meter like you see in so many other games. It's a reflection of Arthur's internal struggle with his own nature. A high honor Arthur isn't suddenly a saint who never did anything wrong. He's a man trying desperately to do something good with the time he has left, trying to balance the scales even though he knows there's not enough time or enough good deeds in the world to make up for what he's done. A low honor Arthur isn't a cackling villain either. He's a man who's embraced the only thing he knows how to be, who's decided that if he's damned anyway, he might as well go down fighting. Both versions of Arthur are tragic because both versions die knowing they wasted their lives on Dutch's lies. The difference is whether Arthur finds peace in his final moments or dies angry and afraid. That's powerful storytelling, and it only works because the game trusts you to understand that redemption isn't about erasing your sins. It's about choosing to be better even when it doesn't change your fate. The way the game handles Arthur's relationship with the gang is crucial to understanding why this story works so well. These aren't just NPCs who stand around camp waiting for you to trigger a mission. They're people with their own routines, their own relationships, their own character arcs that happen whether Arthur is there to see them or not. You can completely miss Molly O'Shea's descent into paranoia and alcoholism if you don't pay attention to the camp interactions. You can miss Sean drinking herself to death over Sean. You can miss the Reverend Swanson slowly pulling himself together and finding redemption in sobriety. The game doesn't force you to care about these people, but if you take the time to talk to them, to sit around the campfire and listen to their stories, to observe how they interact with each other. You start to understand why Arthur is so loyal to this group. They're not just criminals, they're his family. Dutch found Arthur when he was a kid and raised him. Hosea taught him to read. John is like a little brother to him, even when they're at each other's throats. These relationships have decades of history behind them, and the game makes you feel that weight without ever resorting to heavy-handed exposition dumps. You learn about the gang's history through casual conversations, through the photographs scattered around camp, through Arthur's journal entries where he reflects on how things used to be.
And that's what makes the gang's inevitable collapse so devastating. This isn't like other games where your companions might betray you for some twist that comes out of nowhere. You watch the Vanderlinde gang fall apart in real time, mission by mission, mistake by mistake. Dutch's plans keep getting more desperate and more violent. Micah keeps whispering poison in Dutch's ear, driving a wedge between Arthur and the man he once idolized. Hosea dies in the St. Denis bank robbery, and with him dies any hope that someone can talk sense into Dutch. The gang splits between those who can see that Dutch has lost his mind and those who are too loyal or too stupid or too dependent on him to admit it. By the time you reach Chapter 6, the camp doesn't even feel like a camp anymore. People aren't talking to each other. There are no celebrations, no songs around the campfire. Everyone's just waiting for the end. The game makes you feel the weight of that disintegration because you've spent dozens of hours with these people. You've gone on jobs with them, saved their lives, listened to their problems, and now you have to watch them turn on each other, or die, or scatter to the wind. That's not something a 2-hour movie can do. That requires the time investment that only a video game can ask of its audience. Dutch Vanderlinde is the key to understanding why this story resonates so powerfully. On the surface, he seems like a straightforward villain, a charismatic cult leader who uses philosophy and fancy words to manipulate people into doing terrible things. But the brilliance of Dutch's character is that the game never lets you completely write him off. You see moments where the Dutch that Arthur remembers, the man who raised him and taught him to read and supposedly stood for something more than just robbery and murder, that man is still in there somewhere. When Dutch saves Arthur in the opening mission, riding out into a blizzard to find his lost people, you can see why Arthur followed him. When Dutch talks about how civilization is just another word for control, about how they're fighting for freedom in a world that wants to put everyone in boxes, there's something almost noble in his words, even if his actions betray them. The tragedy of Dutch isn't that he always was evil, it's that he was always selfish. And the pressure of being hunted, of losing people, of his plans constantly failing, that pressure strips away the veneer of nobility until all that's left is a paranoid narcissist who would rather watch his family die than admit he was wrong. The game gives you plenty of evidence that Dutch was always like this, if you know where to look. He's already on his third serious relationship by the time the game starts, having cast aside Susan Grimshaw and gotten Annabelle killed, and now he's with Molly, who he treats terribly the moment things get difficult. He talks about loyalty and family constantly, but he's perfectly willing to let John hang, to leave Arthur to die in the oil fields, to sacrifice anyone who questions him. He has speeches written out in advance, practicing his words so they'll sound spontaneous and profound. He keeps talking about having a plan, about one more big score, about getting enough money to disappear to Tahiti or Australia or anywhere the law can't reach them, but there's never enough money. There's always one more job, one more score, one more enemy to deal with first. Dutch's tragedy is that he probably believes his own lies. He probably does think he's fighting for freedom and protecting his family.
But when he's forced to choose between his pride and his people, between admitting failure and pushing forward into disaster, he chooses pride every single time. That's what makes him such a compelling antagonist. He's not evil for evil's sake. He's a man whose flaws destroy everyone who trusted him. The relationship between Arthur and John is another masterclass in character development. These two men, who should be brothers, who were raised by the same fathers, who have been through hell together, they spend most of the game at each other's throats. Arthur resents John for abandoning the gang for a year when Jack was born, for being welcomed back with open arms by Dutch while Arthur had to stay and do all the work. Arthur resents that Dutch seems to favor John, despite John being less capable, less reliable, less loyal. And underneath all that resentment is a deeper pain. Arthur had a son once, a boy named Isaac, and Isaac and his mother were murdered for pocket change while Arthur was off robbing and killing for Dutch's grand vision. Arthur looks at John with Abigail and Jack and sees everything he lost, everything he could have had if he'd made different choices. So when Arthur is angry at John for not appreciating his family, for not being a better father to Jack, it's not just about John's failures, it's about Arthur's regrets. That complexity makes their eventual reconciliation so powerful. Arthur doesn't just help John escape because it's the right thing to do. He does it because he wants John to have the life Arthur never could. He wants to believe that someone can escape this life, that Dutch's poison doesn't have to destroy everyone it touches. Arthur's sacrifice at the end isn't just about redemption for his own sins, it's about giving John a chance at redemption too. The way this game uses its setting is something that doesn't get talked about enough. The Old West of Red Dead 2 isn't a mythologized playground where cowboys are heroes and everyone speaks in gravelly one-liners. It's a world in transition, a world dying in real time, and the game never lets you forget that. Every chapter of the game moves you further east, from the mountains to the heartlands to the cities, from the wilderness to civilization. You start the game in snow-covered mountains where the gang is barely surviving, and you end it in the swamps of Lemoyne where everything is decay and rot. That geographical progression mirrors the thematic progression of the story. The Old West is being paved over, turned into something controlled and regulated and safe. The Indians are being pushed off their land and confined to reservations. The buffalo that once roamed in massive herds are nearly extinct. Towns are becoming cities, and cities are becoming centers of industry and commerce where there's no place for outlaws and gunslingers. Dutch keeps talking about finding somewhere they can be free, somewhere they can live by their own rules, but that place doesn't exist anymore. The world has moved on, and people like Dutch and Arthur and the gang are relics of a time that's already over. They just don't want to admit it yet. This is where the game's obsessive attention to detail becomes more than just impressive technical achievement. It becomes thematic reinforcement. The way NPCs have daily schedules and routines, the way animals behave realistically, the way your guns get dirty and need to be cleaned, the way Arthur's hair grows and needs to be cut, all of this serves to make the world feel real in a way that supports the story's themes. This isn't a game world that exists just for the player to shoot things in. It's a living, breathing place with its own rules and rhythms, and you're just one small part of it. That matters because the story is about men who think they can resist the march of history through violence and willpower, And the game is constantly showing you that the world is bigger than any individual, that change is inevitable no matter how many people you shoot or trains you rob. The realism isn't just showing off, it's making a point. You can hunt every animal, rob every train, help every stranger, and the world keeps turning. The Pinkertons keep hunting you, towns keep growing, the wilderness keeps shrinking. You can't stop progress with bullets. The game's side content reinforces this theme in ways that are easy to miss if you're just rushing through the main story. The stranger missions aren't just random quests to pad out the game, they're stories about people trying to survive in this changing world. You meet artists and scientists and inventors who represent the new world pushing out the old. You meet veterans of the Civil War still fighting battles that ended decades ago. You meet former slaves dealing with the aftermath of emancipation in a country that's nominally free, but still deeply racist. You meet Native Americans watching their culture and way of life being systematically destroyed. Every single one of these side stories is about change, about adaptation, about what gets lost when the world moves on. Even the stranger missions that seem silly or comedic have this undercurrent of melancholy to them. The robot inventor who gets killed by his own creation. The artist who has to flee the country because his work is too progressive. The photographer trying to capture a world that's disappearing. They're all small tragedies that mirror the larger tragedy of Arthur and the gang. Nobody gets to hold on to the past, no matter how hard they try. What's particularly masterful is how the game lets you choose how much of this you engage with. If you just want to play through the main story missions, you can do that, and you'll get a complete narrative about the fall of the Vanderlyn gang. But if you take the time to explore, to do the side missions, to read Arthur's journal, to listen to camp conversations, to pay attention to the environmental storytelling, you get layers upon layers of additional meaning. You find out that Arthur is actually quite well read and references Shakespeare and Greek mythology. You discover that he's a talented artist who sketches the world around him. You learn about his relationship with Mary Linton and why it fell apart. You find out about Isaac and what that loss did to him. You see him struggling with his faith, with his morality, with his place in the world. Arthur becomes more than just a protagonist. He becomes a fully realized person. And that's something video games rarely achieve. Most game protagonists are blank slates for the player to project onto, or they're action heroes who shoot first and ask questions never. Arthur is neither. He's a man with a rich inner life, with regrets and hopes and fears, and the game trusts you to discover that on your own, rather than forcing it on you. The honor system is where all of this comes together in a way that's unique to video games as a medium. Other games have morality systems, but they're usually shallow good or evil choices that don't really affect your character beyond maybe changing your ending. Red Dead 2's honor system is different, because it's not about making the right or wrong choice in a handful of key moments, it's about how you choose to live in the world. Do you help strangers who ask for your help, or do you rob them? Do you pay your debts, or do you threaten and intimidate people? Do you hunt animals cleanly and use what you kill, or do you slaughter everything in sight and leave the carcasses to rot? These aren't big, dramatic moral choices. They're small decisions you make dozens of times throughout the game, and they add up to define who Arthur is. The genius of it is that both high honor and low honor Arthur are valid interpretations of the character. High honor Arthur is a man trying desperately to do some good with his remaining time, to be the person Mary and Hosea thought he could be. Low honor Arthur is a man who's accepted what he is, who's decided that there's no point in pretending to be anything else. Both versions work because the game has established Arthur as someone capable of great kindness and terrible violence, and it lets you decide which side wins out.
This is where the game's structure becomes crucial. The first 5 chapters are about the illusion that things might work out. Dutch's plans keep failing, but there's always another plan, always another score.
People die, but the gang keeps moving forward. Arthur might disagree with Dutch's decisions, but he still follows orders because that's what he's always done. The world is changing, but maybe they can find a place to hide from it. Chapter 5 in Guarma is where that illusion starts to crack. The gang is scattered, wounded, trapped on a foreign island, fighting in someone else's revolution, and for what? Dutch keeps talking about grand plans and noble causes, but they're just killers helping other killers. When they finally make it back to America, nothing has been accomplished except more people are dead and the law is closer than ever. And then comes Chapter 6, and this is where the game shifts from a story about the fall of the gang to a story about Arthur's redemption. The TB diagnosis is the catalyst that forces Arthur to confront what his life has been and what little time he has left. Everything that seemed important, Dutch's plans, the gang's survival, getting enough money to escape, all of it becomes secondary to the question of what Arthur's life meant and what he can do to make it mean something better. This is why the pacing of Chapter 6 is so different from the rest of the game. The earlier chapters have a rhythm to them, missions interspersed with time at camp, moments of action balanced with quiet character development. Chapter 6 is relentless, mission after mission, everything falling apart, the camp shrinking as people die or leave or betray each other, Arthur getting sicker and weaker, the music becoming more melancholic and desperate. The game stops being fun in a traditional sense. It becomes emotionally exhausting, and that's intentional. You're supposed to feel the weight of everything collapsing, the inevitability of the end. And in the middle of all this, you get those side missions with Edith Downs, with Sister Calderon, with Rainsfall. Missions that are entirely about Arthur trying to make amends, trying to help people he's hurt, trying to leave the world slightly better than he found it. These missions aren't required to finish the story, but they're required to give Arthur's death meaning. Without them, Arthur dies a violent criminal who accomplished nothing. With them, Arthur dies a man who recognized his mistakes and tried to fix them, who helped people who needed help, who chose kindness over violence when he could. That choice, that's what redemption means in this game. It's not about being forgiven, it's about choosing to be better. The final missions of the game are where everything comes together. Dutch has completely lost his mind, convinced that the gang is being betrayed from within, trusting only Micah, who's actually the rat. Arthur is dying, coughing blood, barely able to stand, but he's more clear-eyed than he's been in years. He sees Dutch for what he is, a broken man whose pride destroyed everyone who trusted him. He sees that the gang is finished, that there's no escape, that the best he can do is save the few people who deserve saving. And he sees that John has to get out, has to survive, has to have the chance at the life Arthur never got. The choice between going back for the money or helping John escape isn't really a choice about money. It's a choice about what matters more, revenge and material wealth, or family and sacrifice. The game has spent 60 hours building to this moment, establishing Arthur's relationship with John, showing Dutch's descent into paranoia, revealing Micah as a snake, and now it asks you what kind of man Arthur is. Is he the enforcer who takes what he wants, or is he the protector who gives everything to save his brother? Both endings are emotionally devastating, but only one is redemption. The high honor ending, where you help John and watch the sunrise, is one of the most perfect endings in video game history. Arthur has spent the entire game being told he's just a killer, that he's not smart enough or good enough to be anything else. He's been Dutch's attack dog, the gang's muscle, the man they send when violence is needed. And in his final moments, weak and dying, having given everything to ensure John and his family escape, Arthur Morgan watches the sunrise over the mountains, and he smiles. He dies knowing he did something good, something that mattered. He dies knowing he was more than just a killer. The game doesn't give you a triumphant victory. It doesn't let you go out in a blaze of glory, taking your enemies with you. It gives you a quiet moment of peace for a man who's lived a violent life. And that peace is earned through every good choice you made as Arthur, every person you helped, every moment of kindness in a cruel world. That's powerful storytelling, and it only works because of everything that came before, because of the time you spent with Arthur, because the game made you care about this man and what happened to him.
And then comes the epilogue. And this is where opinions diverge. Some people feel like the game should have ended with Arthur's death, that playing as John afterward is anticlimactic. But the epilogue is essential for several reasons. First, it completes John's arc. We need to see John build Beecher's hope, marry Abigail, become the man we meet in the first Red Dead Redemption. Without the epilogue, John's story is incomplete. Second, it gives the player closure. After the emotional devastation of Arthur's death, we need time to process that, to continue existing in this world we've spent so long in, to see that life goes on even after tragedy. And third, the epilogue reinforces the themes about revenge and inevitability. John goes after Micah, and it feels righteous because Micah deserves to die for what he did. But in killing Micah, John ensures his own doom. The Pinkertons find Micah's body, they track the killers back to Beecher's Hope, and 8 years later, they use John's family to force him to hunt down his former gang members, which ends with John being shot to death in his own barn. John's revenge costs him everything, just like Arthur warned. The cycle of violence continues, redemption is possible, but it doesn't save you. And the world keeps turning no matter who lives or dies. That's a hard message, maybe too hard for some people, but it's honest in a way that most games aren't willing to be. The epilogue also does something else that's important. It lets you return to the world as someone who's been changed by Arthur's story. You can find Arthur's grave and pay your respects. You can complete side missions Arthur started and see how people remember him. You can visit the places Arthur visited and feel the absence of him. The game becomes haunted by Arthur Morgan, and that's appropriate because the people who loved him are haunted by him too. John names his son Jack after John Marston, but he also gives him the middle name Arthur. Abigail talks about how Arthur saved them. Charles buried Arthur in a beautiful spot overlooking the valley. Even years later, Arthur's impact is felt by the people he saved. That's legacy, and it matters more than any amount of money Dutch was chasing or any fantasy of freedom the gang pretended to believe in. Arthur's legacy is that the people he loved survived and got to live better lives. That's his redemption, and it's more than most people get. What makes Red Dead Redemption 2 a masterpiece isn't any single element. It's how everything works together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The gameplay reinforces the themes. The world design supports the narrative. The side content adds depth to the main story. The character development is earned through time and interaction rather than cutscenes and exposition. The honor system lets you participate in Arthur's moral journey. The attention to detail creates immersion that makes you care about these people in this world. And the story itself is about something meaningful, about change and loss and redemption, and what it means to be a good person when the world doesn't reward goodness. This is a game that respects your time and intelligence, that trusts you to engage with it on a deeper level, that doesn't spell everything out or hold your hand. It's a game that understands that the best stories are about people, not plots, about internal struggles rather than external conflicts, about quiet moments of connection rather than bombastic set pieces.
though it has plenty of those too. This is also a game that understands tragedy. Arthur Morgan's story is a tragedy in the classical sense. He's a fundamentally decent man whose loyalty to the wrong person destroys his life. He realizes his mistakes too late to save himself, but not too late to save others. His death is inevitable from the moment he's diagnosed with tuberculosis. But what happens before that death, that's up to you. You can't save Arthur, but you can decide whether he finds peace or dies afraid. You can't stop the Vanderling gang from falling apart, but you can help the people who deserve to escape. You can't change the fact that the Old West is dying, but you can choose how you navigate that dying world. The game's willingness to sit in tragedy, to not offer easy answers or happy endings, to acknowledge that good people can do terrible things and bad people can have sympathetic motivations. That's what elevates it above most video game stories. It's mature in a way that has nothing to do with violence or profanity and everything to do with emotional honesty. The performances deserve special mention because they're crucial to why this story works. Roger Clark's portrayal of Arthur Morgan is one of the best performances in video game history. He brings such depth and nuance to Arthur, making him funny and tough and vulnerable and sad, often in the same scene. You believe Arthur as a hardened killer, and you believe him as a man who's afraid of dying, and you believe him as someone trying desperately to do better. The rest of the cast is equally strong. Benjamin Byron Davis makes Dutch charismatic enough that you understand why people follow him, while also showing the cracks in his facade. Peter Blomquist makes Micah absolutely detestable, one of the most hate-worthy villains in gaming, but he never makes him cartoonish. Rob Wadoff returns as John and shows a different side of the character, younger and less confident, but growing into the hero he'll become. The performances are so good that you forget you're playing a video game and start relating to these characters as if they were real people. That's the highest compliment you can pay to any acting performance, and it's true of the entire cast.
The music is another crucial element that often gets overlooked. The original score by Woody Jackson is perfect, using simple motifs that evolve throughout the game, becoming more complex and more melancholic as the story darkens. The ways certain themes are associated with certain characters or emotions, the way the music swells during emotional moments without becoming manipulative, the way silence is used just as effectively as sound, it's all masterfully done. And then there are the licensed songs, used sparingly but effectively. That's the way it is, playing as Arthur rides back to camp for the final time, reflecting on everything that's happened and everything that's about to happen. Unshaken during the final mission as Arthur helps John escape. These songs aren't just background music, they're commenting on the action, adding emotional weight, giving voice to what Arthur might be feeling. The music never tells you how to feel, but it creates space for you to feel deeply. And that's what great music should do. The technical achievement of Red Dead 2 cannot be overstated. This is a game that took 8 years and 2,000 people to create. The scale of it is almost incomprehensible. Every blade of grass, every animal behavior, every NPC routine, every line of dialogue, every mission, every side quest, every random encounter, all of it had to be created and implemented and tested. The fact that the game works as well as it does, that it's as polished as it is, that there are so few bugs or breaks in immersion, is a testament to the skill and dedication of everyone who worked on it. Yes, there are stories about crunch and difficult working conditions during the game's development, and those shouldn't be ignored or excused. But the work itself, the game that resulted from all that effort, is undeniably remarkable. This is what AAA game development can achieve when given the time and resources and creative vision to do something genuinely ambitious. But technical achievement alone doesn't make a masterpiece. Plenty of games have impressive graphics or huge open worlds or detailed systems.
What makes Red Dead 2 special is that all of that technical prowess is in service of the story and themes. The huge world exists so you can feel how small the gang is in the face of civilization's advance. The detailed systems exist so you can feel like a real person in this world, making choices that matter. The impressive graphics exist so the beauty of the world contrasts with the ugliness of what you're doing in it. Everything serves the narrative, and the narrative is about something that matters. That's what separates a technical showcase from art. Art has something to say, and Red Dead Redemption 2 has a lot to say about loyalty and change and redemption and the death of the frontier and what it means to be a man when traditional masculinity is becoming obsolete. These are big themes, universal themes, and the game explores them with intelligence and nuance. This is a game about fathers and sons, about the men who raised Arthur and John and how their influence shaped these men for better and for worse. Dutch is a father figure who uses his children for his own ends, who teaches them philosophy and violence in equal measure, who demands absolute loyalty while giving none in return. Hosea is the father who actually cares, who teaches practical wisdom, who sees his boys as people rather than tools. Arthur becomes a father to John in the end, teaching him what Dutch never could, that there are things more important than loyalty to an idea or a man, that family means sacrifice, that being a good father means wanting better for your children than you had for yourself. And the tragedy is that Arthur learned this too late to save his own son, so all he can do is make sure John doesn't make the same mistakes. That cycle of trauma and growth and learning, that's what makes these characters feel real. They're not just archetypes or plot devices. They're people shaped by their experiences, trying to be better than they were taught to be, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing. The game also grapples with American history in ways that most Westerns avoid. It doesn't shy away from the racism of the era, from the treatment of Native Americans, from the aftermath of the Civil War and slavery. These aren't just background details, they're integrated into the story. You help a former slave escape bounty hunters. You befriend Charles, who's half Native American, and hear his perspective on how his people are being destroyed. You meet Lenny, who talks about his father being lynched. You see Chinese immigrants being treated as subhuman. You encounter former Confederates who lost the war but haven't let go of their cause. The game doesn't preach or lecture. It presents these realities as part of the world and lets you draw your own conclusions. Some people criticize the game for not going far enough, for still centering white men in its story, and that's a fair criticism. But within the constraints of the Western genre and the story it's telling, Red Dead Redemption 2 does more to acknowledge the darkness of American history than most games would dare to.
What's particularly interesting is how the game handles the concept of civilization versus freedom. Dutch talks constantly about freedom, about living by their own rules, about not being controlled by society's laws and expectations. And on one level, there's something romantic about that, the idea of being truly free. But the game makes clear that Dutch's freedom is really just selfishness, the freedom to take what you want and hurt who you want without consequences. Real freedom, the game suggests, comes from taking responsibility, from caring about people, from being part of a community even when that means sacrifice. John finds more freedom as a rancher than he ever had as an outlaw because he's free to build something, to have a future, to not constantly look over his shoulder. Arthur finds more freedom in choosing to help others than he ever had following Dutch's orders. The game is skeptical of the mythology of the lone cowboy, the idea that real men don't need anyone and make their own way through strength and violence. It argues instead that connection is what makes us human, that we find meaning through our relationships,
that there's more courage in admitting you need help than in pretending you don't. The relationship between the game's mechanics and its themes is worth exploring in depth. The core gameplay loop is about survival, about maintaining Arthur's health and stamina, about keeping your weapons clean and your horse fed. These survival mechanics could be seen as tedious busy work, and for some players they are. But they served a thematic purpose. They make you feel Arthur's physicality, his existence as a body in the world that needs care and attention. When Arthur gets sick, when he starts coughing more and moving slower, you feel it in the gameplay. The game literally makes you experience Arthur's decline through the mechanics, and that creates an emotional connection that wouldn't exist if Arthur was just a health bar. Similarly, the game's insistence on realistic animations, on making every action take time, reinforces that this is a real world with real consequences. You can't instantly teleport or access your entire inventory anywhere. You have to physically ride to locations, physically pick up items, physically interact with the world. This grounds everything, makes it feel consequential, makes you think about your actions rather than just mindlessly shooting your way through. The hunting mechanics are particularly interesting in this regard. The game teaches you to track animals, to understand their behavior, to kill them cleanly, and use what you harvest. This is contrasted with the senseless violence of the outlaw lifestyle, where you kill people for money or because Dutch says so. Hunting has purpose and respect. It's about survival and using what nature provides. Robbery and murder are just destruction for greed. The game never makes this contrast explicit through dialogue, but it's there in the mechanics. You're rewarded for being a good hunter through better pelts and materials. You're punished for being a bad person through bounties and people fearing you. The game is teaching you through play that there's a right way and a wrong way to live, even in a world as violent as the Old West. The wanted system, frustrating as it can be, also serves the themes. You can't just murder your way through problems without consequences. The law will come after you. Bounty hunters will chase you. Towns will remember you. You're forced to live with your choices in a way that most open-world games don't require. Grand Theft Auto, Rockstar's other big franchise, is about consequence-free chaos. You can blow up half a city and lose the cops for hiding for 30 seconds. Red Dead 2 makes you feel the weight of your actions. If you rob a store, that shopkeeper will remember you. If you shoot up a town, you'll be wanted there, potentially for the rest of the game, unless you pay off your bounty. This connects to Arthur's arc because he's a man trying to escape the consequences of a lifetime of violence, and the game keeps reminding you that you can't escape what you've done. You can only choose to do better going forward. The camp system is another example of mechanics serving story. You're encouraged to contribute money and resources to the camp, to do chores, to interact with the gang members. None of this is strictly necessary to progress the story, but it deepens your connection to these people. When you've spent time talking to Sean around the campfire, his death hits harder. When you've listened to Javier play guitar and sing, his eventual betrayal stings more. When you've watched Uncle loaf around camp for hours, his loyalty at the end means something. The game is using the interactive nature of the medium to create bonds that a passive viewer couldn't have. You're not just watching Arthur care about these people, you're choosing to spend time with them, to help them, to be part of this community. And that makes the community's destruction your loss, not just Arthur's. Even the controversial slow walking sections serve a purpose. Yes, it's frustrating to have control taken away while characters slowly walk and talk through a town or camp. But these moments force you to be present, to listen to the dialogue, to observe the world around you. In a game where you can sprint everywhere and skip through content, These moments of enforced slowness make you stop and pay attention. They're saying, this conversation matters. This moment matters. You need to be here for this. It's a technique borrowed from games like The Last of Us, and while it's not for everyone, it does create a different kind of pacing, a more deliberate storytelling that stands in contrast to the breakneck speed of most action games. The game trusts that you'll stick around for the story even when you're not shooting, and for players who connect with the characters and narrative, that trust is rewarded. The photography system, where you can pause the action and take pictures, is a small feature that adds surprising depth. It encourages you to look at the world, to find beauty in it, to capture moments. And when you look through Arthur's photos later, they become a record of his journey, of the places he went and the things he saw. It's a way of marking time, of creating memories, of finding meaning in experiences beyond just completing objectives. This is a game that wants you to slow down and appreciate the world it's created, not just rush through checking boxes. And for players willing to engage with it on those terms, it offers an experience unlike anything else in gaming. You're not conquering this world, you're living in it. And there's a profound difference between those two approaches. The game's approach to violence is also worth examining. This is an incredibly violent game. There's no getting around that. You kill hundreds, if not thousands of people throughout the story. The combat is visceral and brutal, with realistic wound physics and gore. But the game never celebrates violence the way many shooters do. The story is constantly questioning the cost of this lifestyle, showing how violence destroys everyone it touches. Arthur is dying partly because he spent years fighting in close quarters with infected people, his tuberculosis a direct result of his violent profession. Characters you care about die suddenly and pointlessly. The gang's violence brings more violence down on them until they're overwhelmed. Even the gameplay reinforces this. The way enemies cry out for help or try to surrender. The way wounded men crawl away. The way Arthur's hands shake when his morality is low. The game wants you to feel the weight of every death, to understand that this isn't heroic or glorious. It's ugly and destructive. This is where the Deadeye system becomes thematically relevant. On one hand, it's a gaming mechanic that makes combat easier and more spectacular, letting you slow time and mark targets for stylish kills. But it's also Arthur's professional skill, the thing he's trained his entire life to do. He's preternaturally good at killing people, and the game makes you feel how easy that is for him. And as Arthur becomes more disillusioned with his life, as he tries to be better, you start to feel the disconnect between Arthur's skills and Arthur's values. He's trying to be a good man, but the only thing he's really good at is violence. That tension is at the heart of his character, and it's something you feel through playing as him. You have all these tools for killing, and the game keeps putting you in situations where killing seems like the only option, but the story is telling you that killing is the problem. It's an uncomfortable contradiction, and that discomfort is intentional. The game also does something interesting with the concept of choice and agency. Most of your big story decisions are actually made for you. Arthur will do what the story requires regardless of what you might want. You can't choose to leave the gang early. You can't choose to kill Micah before the end. You can't choose to convince Dutch to give up his plans. Your agency exists in the margins, in how you treat people, in whether you help or hurt, in how you conduct yourself between the story beats. This could be seen as a limitation, but it's actually a deliberate choice that serves the story. Arthur's tragedy is that he doesn't have the freedom to choose a different path until it's too late. He's been shaped by his upbringing and his loyalty to Dutch, and breaking free of that programming takes the entire game. By the time Arthur is ready to make different choices, he's dying. The game's limited player agency reflects Arthur's limited agency within his own life. You're not a blank slate character who can be anyone. You're Arthur Morgan. And Arthur Morgan has a specific history and psychology that constrains his options. Understanding that is key to understanding why the story works.
This connects to one of the deeper themes of the game, which is about cycles of violence and trauma. Dutch was shaped by his own past, by whatever made him the way he is, and he passed that trauma onto Arthur and John. Arthur is trying to break that cycle by teaching John to be different, to value his family over the gang, to choose life over death. But the cycle is hard to break because violence is all these men know. It's how they solve problems, how they prove themselves, how they relate to the world. The game is showing how trauma perpetuates itself across generations, how damaged people create more damaged people, and how hard it is to choose something different when you've been raised to see violence as the answer. Arthur's redemption isn't just about his own soul, it's about trying to save John and Jack from following the same path. And the tragedy is that John does follow that path, not because Arthur failed to teach him better, but because the world they live in doesn't offer many alternatives. Even with Arthur's sacrifice, even with Beecher's hope and a family and an honest life, John still ends up dying violently, because violence is the world he knows. The treatment of masculinity in this game is fascinating because it's both a celebration and a critique of traditional masculine ideals. Arthur is tough, stoic, capable with his fists and his guns, protective of those weaker than him. He embodies a lot of what we think of as masculine virtues. But the game also shows how those virtues can become toxic when taken to extremes, how stoicism becomes emotional repression, how protectiveness becomes control, how strength becomes violence. Dutch represents toxic masculinity fully realized, a man so concerned with appearing strong and in control that he can't admit weakness or error, who sees asking for help as betrayal, who measures his worth by how many people follow him. Arthur's arc is about learning a different kind of strength, the strength to admit you're afraid, to ask for forgiveness, to put someone else's needs above your own ego. The game is arguing that real strength isn't about dominance, it's about vulnerability and sacrifice. That's a radical message for a AAA action game to make, and it does it without being preachy or obvious about it. The women in this game are interesting because they're often smarter and more capable than the men, but they're constrained by the social roles of the era. Sadie Adler is the most obvious example, a woman who wants to fight but is told to do chores instead, who has to prove herself over and over to be taken seriously. Her arc is about refusing to be defined by her role as a grieving widow, and instead becoming a warrior in her own right. But the game is clear that this path costs her something. By the end, she's a skilled bounty hunter, but she's also alone and seemingly empty, living for violence because she has nothing else. The game doesn't judge her for this, but it does show that revenge and violence don't heal grief, they just create more emptiness. Similarly, Abigail is constantly the voice of reason, telling John that he needs to leave this life, that his family should come first. She's right, and the men know she's right, but they don't listen until it's too late, because listening to a woman would threaten their masculine identity. The game shows how stupid this is without having to explicitly state it. Mary Beth, Tilly, and Karen all have their own struggles and arcs, dealing with being women in a world that offers them few options. They're with the gang because there's nowhere else for them to go, no respectable work available to women without families or connections. The game touches on this reality without dwelling on it, showing how the same society that's pushing out outlaws also oppresses women, and how those two groups might find common cause even if their situations aren't equivalent. Miss Grimshaw is another fascinating character, a woman who's internalized the gang's masculine values, who's harder on the other women than any of the men are,
who's trying to prove her worth by being useful in the ways men value. Her death is particularly tragic because she finally stands up to Dutch, finally chooses what's right over loyalty, and she's immediately killed for it, her sacrifice barely acknowledged. The game's handling of race is more complicated and less successful than its handling of gender, but it does try to engage with the reality of racism in this era. Charles is one of the most morally upright characters in the gang, and he's explicitly dealing with prejudice against Native Americans and black people. Lenny is young and idealistic, and his conversations with Arthur touch on the reality that America in 1899 is only a few decades past slavery, that the promise of freedom hasn't translated to actual equality. The Native American storyline with Rains Fall and Eagle Flies is about the systematic destruction of indigenous peoples, about how the government uses treaties and force to steal land and erase culture. The game is sympathetic to this struggle without being able to fully engage with it because it's still a story centered on white outlaws. That limitation is real, but within those constraints, the game does more than most to acknowledge these realities.
What makes all of this work, what ties all these disparate elements together into a cohesive masterpiece, is the writing. The dialogue in this game is phenomenal, natural and character-specific, full of period-appropriate language without sounding like a history textbook. Every character has a distinct voice and way of speaking. Dutch's flowery, philosophical speeches, Hosea's folksy wisdom, Micah's sneering cruelty, Arthur's dry wit, they all feel like real people talking. The conversations between gang members around camp, the random encounters with strangers, even the throwaway lines during missions, everything is written with care and attention. This is a game that knows the difference between good writing and mere competence, and it consistently delivers the former. The script is massive, hundreds of hours of dialogue, and almost none of it feels like filler or exposition dumps. Characters talk like people talk, digressing and joking, and sometimes not saying what they really mean. And you have to pay attention and read between the lines to understand what's really being communicated. Arthur's journal is a perfect example of this. After missions and major events, Arthur will write about what happened and how he feels about it, and these entries are beautifully written, showing his intelligence and sensitivity in ways that his gruff exterior might hide. The journal gives you direct access to Arthur's inner life, his doubts and fears and hopes, and reading through it over the course of the game is like getting to know a real person. The fact that this journal exists at all, that Rockstar hired someone to write dozens of unique entries that many players will never read, shows the level of commitment to character development. Nothing is half-assed in this game. Every element is fully realized, and that attention to detail across every aspect is what creates the sense of immersion that makes the story so powerful. The game's structure, with its 6-chapter plus epilogue format, creates a rhythm that mirrors Arthur's journey. The early chapters are almost hopeful, despite the gang being on the run. There's a sense that maybe things will work out, that the next score will be the one that lets them escape. By chapter 4, that hope is fading. The gang is more fractured, the law is closer, and Dutch's decisions are becoming more erratic. Chapter 5 is the false escape, a brief reprieve that only makes everything worse. Chapter 6 is the collapse, everything falling apart at once, and through it all, Arthur is getting sicker and more desperate. Each chapter has its own identity and tone, and the progression feels natural rather than arbitrary. You understand why the gang makes each move, why they end up where they do, even when those decisions are mistakes. The story has an internal logic that makes sense within the world and characters that have been established. And then the epilogue does something different, showing you life after Arthur, life after the gang,
what it means to try to build something new from the ruins of what came before. The epilogue is quieter, more domestic, focused on work and building and family rather than robberies and gunfights. Some players find it boring after the intensity of Chapter 6, but it's necessary breathing room. You need time to process Arthur's death, to see that life continues even after tragedy, to understand what John does with the second chance Arthur gave him. The epilogue is hopeful in ways the main story never allowed itself to be, showing John becoming a better man, building a home, marrying Abigail, becoming a proper father to Jack. And then it reminds you that this hope is temporary, that the Pinkertons are still coming, that John's story ends with him bleeding out in his barn while Jack and Abigail escape. The cycle continues. Violence begets violence, and even redemption doesn't equal salvation. This is why Red Dead Redemption 2 is a masterpiece. It's not because it has the best gameplay or the most innovative mechanics or the most revolutionary design. It's a masterpiece because it understands that video games can tell stories that no other medium can tell. Stories that require your participation and time investment to have their full impact. It's a masterpiece because every element of the game, from the core mechanics to the smallest details, serves the larger themes and narrative. It's a masterpiece because it treats its audience as intelligent and patient, trusting that people will engage with a slow burn tragedy that doesn't offer easy answers or happy endings. It's a masterpiece because it created characters that feel like real people, flawed and complex and contradictory, and it made you care about what happens to them. It's a masterpiece because it grapples with big questions about morality and loyalty and change and what it means to live a good life. And it doesn't pretend there are simple answers.
Most importantly, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a masterpiece because it earns every emotional beat. Arthur's redemption isn't handed to him or rushed through in a final act conversion. It's built, mission by mission, choice by choice, moment by moment, throughout the entire game. You see Arthur change because you're making the choices that change him. His death is devastating because you spent 60 or 80 hours with him, taking care of him, living as him, growing attached to him as a person, not just as a protagonist. The game's willingness to demand that time investment and then reward it with a story worth that investment is increasingly rare in modern gaming, where everything is optimized for maximum engagement and minimum friction. Red Dead 2 has friction. It has slow moments and tedious mechanics and gameplay that gets in the way of the story sometimes. But all of that friction serves a purpose. It makes the world feel real. It makes Arthur feel human. It makes the emotional moments hit harder because you've earned them through the hours of living in this world. This game represents what AAA game development can achieve when given the resources and creative freedom to pursue a singular vision. It's not perfect, nothing is, and there are valid criticisms to be made about its portrayal of women and minorities, about its gameplay concessions to realism that sometimes frustrate more than immerse, about the working conditions that produced it. But the work itself, the game that exists, is a towering achievement in interactive storytelling. It proved that video games can tell stories as emotionally complex and thematically rich as any novel or film, that players will engage with difficult subject matter and ambiguous morality if treated with respect, that spectacle and substance aren't mutually exclusive. Red Dead Redemption 2 raised the bar for what storytelling in games can be. Not just bigger maps or more content, but worlds that feel alive and meaningful, where exploration reveals stories and character moments rather than just loot and quest markers.
It showed that survival mechanics can add to immersion rather than just being tedious busy work when properly integrated into the world and story. It demonstrated that you can make a critically and commercially successful game that doesn't hold the player's hand, that respects their intelligence and patience. And most importantly, it proved that video games can break your heart, that interactive storytelling can achieve the same emotional depth as any other art form, that a fictional cowboy named Arthur Morgan can matter to people years after they've finished his story. In the end, what makes Red Dead Redemption 2 a masterpiece is how it makes you feel. The first time you watch Arthur help John onto that horse and tell him to run, to be with his family, knowing that Arthur is dying and John is his last chance to do something good. The first time you watch the sunrise as Arthur takes his final breath, having given everything to save someone else. The first time you finish the epilogue and ride to that hill overlooking the valley and find Arthur's grave and just sit there for a moment, thinking about everything that happened. These moments stay with you long after you've put the controller down. They change how you think about video games as a medium and what they're capable of achieving. That's what art does. It moves you, it challenges you, it makes you see the world differently. And Red Dead Redemption 2, for all its violence and profanity and moral complexity, is art. It's a masterpiece not because it's perfect, but because it aims for something greater than mere entertainment and largely achieves it. It's a game that respects you enough to tell you a tragic story without apologizing for the tragedy, to show you flawed people without excusing their flaws, to demand your time and attention and emotional investment and then reward that with something genuinely meaningful. That's rare in any medium, and it's what makes this game special. It's why people are still talking about Arthur Morgan years after they've finished his story, why his story resonates, why this game matters. It's a masterpiece because it earned that designation through every painstaking detail, every thoughtful character moment, every thematic choice, every hour of gameplay that builds to an ending that hurts but feels right. That's all you can ask of a story, and Red Dead Redemption 2 delivers it better than almost anything else in gaming has managed to do.